So let's go back to Philo. So another very interesting thing. So we talked about all this allegory and how this is actually common in Greek-speaking, actually for Greeks for their own mythology, and also for other Greek-speaking Jews for their interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. Let's go back to another one of Philo's major ideas, and this is his conception of logos. So the heart of a bunch of his ideas, and it's actually all over the place throughout all his texts, Philo derives when he's doing all of his allegorical reading of Scripture is to kind of winnow out and to bring forward and explain his idea of logos, which is this amazingly important Greek word that means everything from word, but not so much just like a individual word, but word itself in a bigger sense, discourse, reason, logic, all kinds of different things logos means. For Philo, he says in different places, logos is the firstborn of God, which is to say the highest intermediate between, highest intermediate being necessary to bridge the enormous gap between the infinite and humans. So inasmuch as Philo, as we were just saying when I explained, we kind of did that whole, God is all of this stuff, right? And Philo went on and on and on in that address of oneness, this way too much that God actually represents. To get between God then and then individual guys like Philo and me, there needs to be then some kind of intermediary so we can kind of, even understand, have some kind of connection. And the most important intermediating bridge between God and individuals is the logos, which Philo then calls here the firstborn of God. So, form. Is what?
You equate the logos to the form.
Yes.
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, does Philo call the logos a form, or the form, and he does at some point or other equate it with the form of forms. So for him, it's not the ultimate. The ultimate is essentially God, and then this is the next one. So it's like, so Aristotle has like a demiurge, so there's like the different kinds of levels, essentially the very first one after God, so form after God. So Philo writes, for the Father of the universe has caused him, the Logos, to spring up as the eldest son, whom in another passage, Moses, so again he's quoting Moses, or he's deriving this from Moses, or his allegorical interpretation of Moses calls the firstborn, and he, who is thus born, imitating the ways of his father, has formed such and such species, looking to his archetypal patterns. So essentially all of creation is happening through this form of the Logos, God's Logos. So in different texts, we can't go into it as a really long, complicated, different way, and it's actually somewhat contradictory sometimes, all the different things. Philo's also a mystic. Philo's also a mystic. Philo's also a mystic. And so he has different ways that he thinks about the Logos, but he calls the Logos as things such as the form of forms, so that's almost like what Plato's good is. The firstborn of God, who is then unbegotten also. Divine wisdom, the daughter of God. He goes through a whole long way in which the form of God is, or the Logos is neither male or female, or is actually both, and so therefore can be, even though wisdom in both Hebrew and Greek is a female word, and so therefore the female divine, we shouldn't get all hung up about that, he says. So essentially it's both the Son of God and the daughter wisdom. And a second hypostasization of God. And so if you might be aware of this word hypostasis, but only if you're a Christian theologian. so we'll get to hypostasis, or maybe if you're Valerie.
Sorry.
Yeah. And so anyway, a second hypostasization of God in the form of God's creative power. So in other words, the Logos in some senses essentially is God, but different from the Creator, the hypostasization of God's power, so essentially a second person of God, and the mediator then between the Creator and the created universe, and the thing that's filling the universe, and mediating between the two different portions of God, the justice and the mercy. So there's all kinds of different things in this conception of Logos. But what's especially interesting because otherwise Philo would just it'd be his own speculation, and he doesn't have any descendants in this. But how much the Logos then makes it into Christianity's own peculiar theology. And so in the retelling of this same Genesis story that we've been reading Philo's commentary on from the fourth gospel, as we say, that's attributed to John, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. I mean, it's usually, we say word, we're not using that Greek, but the Greek here is the Logos. He was in the beginning with God, all things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being, right? And so it's almost the same, in that portion of it, the same idea of the Logos, and in this case, this hypostasis of God, who is God, right, is with God and is God, then is understood the second person of the Trinity to be Christ in Christianity, right? So it's possible but uncertain whether Philo was read by the author of John, and also the letters. There's a bunch of different stuff in it that kind of indicate they're kind of akin to some of Philo's stuff. The letter to Hebrew and/or Paul, even we've seen have some things. There's nothing though that shows literary dependence, so they're not quoting him or anything. However, Philo's work does influence very important schools of early Christian thinkers, including Clement of Alexandria and his very brilliant student Origen of Alexandria, who's really the first super great Christian theologian and also amazingly prolific and influential. So especially influential in just more or less securing for antiquity and the Middle Ages for Christians allegorical interpretation of Scripture. So in that sense, I mean, whereas it may not indirectly and also somewhat directly, Christianity, Philo is arguably sort of massively influential over especially then interpretation of Scripture, but also gave a lot of tools to later Christian theologians in developing doctrines like the Trinity.
Right. Yeah. Where does the word Trinity come from? Earlier 2nd century, Tertullian.
Okay. That's right, Tertullian. Yep.
Tertullian coined the word from the Latin word Trinitas, which means which is a mystic term from a mystery cults, and utilized that term as a way to coin the language.
It also gave a lot of tools to later Christian theologians in developing doctrines like the Trinity. It also gave a lot of tools to later Christian theologians in developing doctrines like the Trinity. What kind of influence did Philo have on Judaism? Not much. Oh, go ahead.